All right, I think we can get started. Today we are very fortunate to have Marcela Eslava with us. She is professor and dean of economics at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota and a research affiliate of LASEA. And she holds a PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park. And following in the line of previous speakers, I'm going to ask Marcela to say a few words about herself before she starts her presentation today about firms and market power and inequality in Latin America. Thank you, Marcela.
Thanks for the invitation. Happy to do so. Yeah, so actually, there's updates. I was dean at Uniandes, but I am no longer the dean. Starting mid-year last year, I went back to being a plain professor at Uniandes. But yeah, I'm also affiliated to LASEA, which is the Latin American Economic Association, where I'm currently the president. I've been working at Los Andes for a very long time now, and most of my work is on firm dynamics and the aggregate implications of the behavior of firms, mostly from the side of understanding productivity. But it turns out that in many countries in Latin America in general is a region where this holds. The behavior of firms has important implications for inequality. The barriers to firm growth and to the allocation of resources across firms in the region, which are the focus of study of much of what I've been doing in the past, have direct implications for how workers and in general people in the economy are assigned to different productive activities, and thus end up having important implications for the incomes of people and how those incomes are distributed. So that's the reason I came to be part of this project on Latin America's inequality, and this is the side from which what I'm going to be presenting today stands. So it's a little bit of a different stance on inequality to probably what you've been seeing in other presentations. It also, you'll see, uses methodological tools that are a little bit different. And so in that sense, please do feel free to stop me if at any point you want to do so. Any question is welcome.
Excellent.
Should I get started?
Yes.
Okay. So I participated in two different papers of these last year project, both of them on inequality and firms. Inequality and firms is an issue that has become frontline in the last few years in all of the world. You may have heard concerns about rising inequality in the developed world, very importantly in the US and in other English-speaking countries, also in Europe, but also in continental Europe, more generally in other developed economies. Um, in all of these regions, that concern has been linked to the increase in the share of income that goes to capital owners and to the owners of giant corporations. So there's been a focus on how the growth, and in particular the very rapid growth of huge corporations, has been tied to rising wealth by specific individuals, and in turn how that has impacted the equality of the distribution of income, in particular in terms of what we call functional inequality. That's the division of income between workers and entrepreneurs. So this is a focus that's there globally. It has to do, as I said, with the increasing inequality observed in these regions. But much of the work that has been conducted on these issues, which is vast by now, has focused precisely on developed economies. Much less is known about the relationship between firms and the sizes of firms, the distribution of firms between giant corporations and smaller businesses. Much less about this is known in less developed economies and on how these relates to inequality in these developed economies. Of course, by now you are very aware that Latin America is a highly unequal region. And so even though it's not clear that inequality has been growing in the region in the last few years, in fact, you probably already saw presentations where the opposite may be the case. Clearly, inequality is a huge concern. And so to the extent that one should expect some link between the size distribution of firms, the fact that large firms may pay less to their workers, to the extent that that's a fact, then understanding how it plays in Latin America's high inequality is important. So this is what these two papers are about. Let me state plainly that this is what I call a stylized facts set of papers. And so there's no claim in here that because firms are large or because firms are small, because firms have certain sizes, that's the reason for inequality. But what I will illustrate is that in the region as well, there is a correlation, there's a relationship between the sizes of firms that we have, the sizes of businesses that we have, and inequality. And I will try to show you that, in fact, this correlation is even stronger than in developed economies, but that the patterns that it highlights are actually very different. Put plainly, what I'm going to be sharing with you says that when fighting against inequality, we need to worry about the types of businesses that we have, the sizes of businesses that we have, but sort of in the opposite way that people are worrying about it in the developed world, not because we have necessarily too many large businesses, but actually the opposite. And even though the concern is not large businesses and therefore large wealth for a few individuals that own those businesses, inequality is very tightly linked to firm size because we have too many tiny businesses, and because the workers in those businesses have a predominant weight in poverty. So it is very much the case that people in a specific part of the income distribution, and in particular the low tail of the income distribution, people with low incomes, and in Latin America that means poor people, are disproportionately located to tiny businesses. So that's much of what I'll be showing today. This comes from this first paper, which is summarizing one of the chapters of the last year project called Business Size Development and Inequality in Latin America. What this paper does, as I said, is just characterize the correlation between business sizes and the incomes of people. Given that the incomes of people are generated in businesses. The challenge and the reason this paper is interesting, even beyond the project itself, is that the studies in the rest of the world have been using information on firms that is traditionally captured from administrative records of registered firms. But of course, in Latin America, a lot of businesses do not register. A lot of businesses are not anywhere in the formal administrative records of businesses. And so we need to find a way to go somewhere else and understand where are all of the workers in Latin America and where their incomes are generated. And we want to do this in comparison to other economies, so we have a full picture of whether there is some correlation between the particularities of inequality in Latin America and the particularities of the business size distribution in Latin America. Once we have that, we will also look into the relationship between the distribution of the incomes of people, the earnings of people, and the individual characteristics of these people and the types of businesses that they are working at. So what we're going to do to solve this issue of the absence of many businesses in Latin America in the administrative records of firms is to try to use the type of methodological tool that you guys have been hearing about when measuring inequality, and those are the household surveys or the employment surveys in the different countries in the region. Almost all countries in the world have some type of measurement uh, similar to a household survey for their formal employment statistics, or I should say, their official employment statistics. Um, and those tools are useful if you want to think about the overall, at least the overall working population, because they are designed to cover and to be representative of that population. What's interesting for the purpose of this chapter is that those tools also measure things related to the types of businesses that people work at. There's two different sites to this that we use in this work. One is these surveys record whether people are whether for people who are working, whether they are self-employed, whether they own a business with employees, or whether they are employees themselves. In many of the self-employed or I should rather say, the self-employed are many times understood as entrepreneurs who hire other people, but in Latin America in particular, many self-employed are simply working for themselves without any other employee. So for those of you who have been looking at the region, you can think about the people who sell, avocados or arepas on the street, or who have a small shop in their houses. They work for themselves. They carry services, or they have a little restaurant at home that they work at, and they have no other employees. So that's the first category here. They may also be owners of other firms where they do employ people, or they may be salaried work. The other thing that's recorded in these surveys is the size of the business that the person is at. So obviously, the self-employed that I described, who are without workers, work at a business of size 1. There's one person in that firm, but for both owners of firms with employees and for people who are salaried workers, these surveys ask how many people work at the firm or at the business where you're also working. That information is reported in relatively broad categories, like 1 to 10 workers, 10 to 50 workers, that type of categorization. But that's what we use to construct the distributions of business sizes that we construct. This, of course, has limitations. When I say that I look at the distribution of business sizes, what the literature in general does, it asks, of the overall population of firms, what fraction is, for instance, between 1 and 10 workers. That's something I cannot answer. What I can tell you is, of the overall population of people who work in the economy, what fraction is working for firms between 1 and 10 workers, between 10 and 50 workers, etc. So that's what I call here the employment weighted business size distribution. That's the object that I am going to be characterizing. Relative to the literature that does focus or that does measure this from firm level information, we have no other business characteristic. The only thing that we know is the sector and the size. And as I already mentioned, we have only broad size categories, not specific numbers of employees. But despite those limitations, this is quite illustrative, and compared to the existing literature, it has the great advantage that it really covers everybody who's working in this economy. This is by contrast with firm level information. As I said, most firm level information, the one that's on administrative records, misses all of the informal sectors. That would be a very important part of the economy, about 50% of employees. But even the other tools that are surveys of firms that aim to cover even informal firms, all of those tend to miss the self-employed segment. And as I'll show you, this is a very important segment in these economies. So what I'll be showing you is basically data that illustrates two facts. One is that the most outstanding feature of the business size distribution in the region is, as I already mentioned, a very massive presence of tiny businesses, including self-employed businesses, that is businesses of one person. I'll also mention that this is not necessarily only at the expense of very large corporations, but even at the expense of SMEs, um, of small and medium enterprises. So that is to say that Latin America has what's called in the literature a missing middle of businesses. And then I'll also show you that this fact that there is a massive presence of tiny businesses is worrisome. Because there is a very close correlation between business size and the income distribution, closer than in other regions, and in the direction that I already mentioned. In particular, that people with very low incomes are very concentrated in these tiny businesses. So let me start with fact number one, the massive presence of tiny businesses in the region. Here you see the distributions of workers in different countries and different regions in the world between three categories of business size. One is businesses of one person, where the owner of the business is also the only employee in the business. Second, businesses of up to 10 workers, what we would call micro enterprises. And then third, the lighter blue is businesses of 10 or more workers. Let me emphasize that this light blue category is not huge firms. It's anything with 10 or more employees. So that would cover small businesses, medium businesses, and large firms and corporations. So what you can see is that compared to any economy in this picture that's relatively high income, the US, the European economies, Asian economies with high income, Latin America has a vast prevalence of employment that's concentrated in micro enterprises and self-employed without employees. So if you think about the aggregation between the two darker bars, in Latin America, that's almost 70% of employment. So almost 70% of workers in these economies are either self-employed or work at a micro business. It's a huge fraction of the working population. And the numbers are basically the opposite if you look at richer economies. In richer economies, about 70% of workers work at a small, medium, or large enterprise, not by their own account or in micro businesses. In fact, in the US, that proportion is even larger. Almost 80% of workers work at firms with 10 or more employees. So this is really a massive difference compared to more developed economies. And in that sense, Latin America is more similar to economies such as India, Pakistan, and Nepal, talking here about only urban India, Pakistan, and Nepal. Of course, there's dispersion within these groups of economies. Different countries have larger or smaller proportions, but if you compare specific countries in all of these regions to specific countries in other regions, you can see that in general in Latin America, the presence of micro businesses and self-employment is much larger than in any of the comparators. As I said, this is mainly let me call it the small light blue bar here. is mainly dominated by the fact that compared to other economies, Latin America is mostly missing small and medium enterprises that are able to absorb larger numbers of employees. So a relatively easy way to see this is if you take my light blue bar in this picture, which has everybody in businesses with 10 or more employees, and split that between smaller categories. Sorry, one sec. Here. In this particular picture, I'm splitting the 10 plus into 10 to 50 and 50 or more, and the 1 to 10 into 1 to 4 and 5 to 10. In these other picture, I'm further splitting the 50 plus into 50, 100, and 100 plus categories. Once you start to do this, you start losing countries because the categories that numbers are reported are not identical across countries, but still you can have a pretty representative picture. And what you start to see is this U-shape emerging, especially for Latin America. So it's not simply that the thing is downward sloping in opposition to the upward sloping in more developed economies. It's like you start to see some concentration or some polarization, I should say, in the ends, and then like a hole in the middle, and that's what we call the missing middle. So that's basically to suggest that this is not simply a feature of development, and that this is not a matter of sitting down and waiting for these countries to grow more and become more developed, and so and hoping that in a few years, by a simple growth, everybody's going to look like the European economies or the United States, because as you see again in these countries, the pattern is completely different. So even for Latin America's current level of development, Latin America has an excess of self-employment and a deficit of small and medium enterprises, and this is what you see in this picture. What I did in this picture is every country is a dot, and what I'm presenting in the vertical axis is the share of workers who are in the different categories. And what you see in the horizontal axis is the log GDP per capita, so the level of development. And what you see is that indeed, more developed economies have less presence of self-employment. This is the downward sloping line here, less presence of micro enterprises. This is the downward sloping line here. And more presence of workers in small, medium, and large enterprises. That's the upward sloping line in the two right panels. However, if you look at Latin America, which is represented by the darker dots, it turns out that the whole region is above, or almost all of the region is above the regression line for self-employment and below the regression line for small enterprises. That is to say, even controlling for the level of development, these countries have disproportionate self-employment and are missing what you would expect in terms of presence of small and medium enterprises. A different way to see the same thing is going back in history and asking, how did the US look when it had the same GDP per capita that Latin American countries have today? Did it have this many self-employed workers? The answer is no. If you go back in history, the US in 1948 had the same GDP per capita that Latin America has today in its median, but yet it had much less self-employment. So let me show you this here. This is the decade of 1940. As I said, around that decade, the US had a GDP per capita similar to the median country in Latin America today. That's close to Peru. However, Peru today has about 48 of its workers self-employed, whereas in the 1940s, the US had 21% workers self-employed. And indeed, that number has been coming down through history in the US, but it has always been lower than in the country that corresponds to the level of GDP in those decades in the US by 2018. Same thing with micro enterprises and the presence of micro enterprises. The sum here, this is the US, of the blue and red bars, that's micro enterprises, has been coming down over the years from the 1970s, which is when this time series starts, but still it was never as high as you see it today in Latin America, where it's over 30%. So again, this is not simply a matter of something that we should sit and wait for it to erode. There's something particular in Latin America that creates these particular distribution of size. It's also not a matter of sectors. Many people think, well, maybe it's because of premature deindustrialization. Latin America didn't have a large enough manufacturing sector, and that's the reason it has tiny enterprises, because the larger businesses are in the manufacturing sector. But in fact, if you look at Latin America within sectors, in any sector, you see the kinds of patterns that I mentioned before. For instance, this is industry, mining, manufacturing, and utilities. And you see within industry, these U-shaped pattern that we were looking at a much larger presence of micro enterprises and self-employment that you see in the US and in Europe. Same thing if you look at wholesale, retail, accommodation, and food services. Those are the less sophisticated services. And if you look at high-skilled services, in high-skilled services, you see less of the U-shaped pattern, but still the presence of self-employment and micro enterprises is much larger than in the US and Europe. So that was fact number one, again, the prevalence of employment in tiny businesses. Then fact number two is what makes this worrisome in terms of inequality. And again, what I try to show you in this fact number two is that there's a close connection between between people's earnings, people's incomes, and the size of the business they are at in Latin America. In fact, a connection that's even closer than you see in other regions, and that connection is particularly worrisome because in the businesses that are prevalent in Latin America, income for the workers is much, much lower. So let me just first, as a first pass to this, show you correlations between the business size distribution and the Gini coefficients for the region, or for the world. Same kind of picture that I showed you before. Horizontal axis is in the left panels, the log GDP per capita. So these two panels in the left come from the picture that I already showed you. In the right, what I do is I repeat this with the Gini index. And the two, the upper and lower panels here are in the top panel, the share of workers who are self-employed. And in the lower panel, the share of workers who are in micro businesses. So as we had already seen, self-employment and micro businesses is much larger in less developed economies. That's the left panel, left set of panels. But in the right, what you see is that in general, the presence of self-employment and micro businesses is positively correlated with the Gini. That is to say, more unequal economies have larger presence of micro entrepreneurship and self-employed workers. Latin America is in blue, and as you already knew from the rest of this course, Latin America is to the right in terms of the Gini index, higher Gini indices, more inequality. But as we've been discussing, it also is above the line and in general in the upper part of the graphs for the presence of self-employment and micro businesses. Here, another look at the same kind of information. And let me explain this picture so you can see what I'm trying to show you here. So what I have here is people people who work in Latin America, split according to their earnings decile. So the leftmost bar here has everybody who's in the 10th, in the first decile of income, people who are with the lowest incomes. Remember that in Latin America, about 30% of the population live in poverty. So that would mean that the three leftmost bars in this first picture correspond to, sorry, my phone's ringing, sorry, correspond to poverty. Everybody in those bars is living in poverty, more or less, because these are households rather than the workers, but more or less. For each of the bars that I'm showing you, I'm splitting people depending on the type of business they work at, the size of those businesses. So forget about the shades for the time being. All you need to know is that the darker blue is self-employment, and then the lightmost shades of blue at the top correspond to people in businesses of 10 or more workers, and they're also split depending on whether they're owners or employees. Let me first point to a very striking number here. If you look at the first decile, the people, the poorest people in the region, 97% of them are either self-employed or work at a micro business. If you start going towards the right, so going up in the income distribution, the number of people who work at businesses that are larger with 10 or more employees starts to grow. It's never too large, never about 50%, even in the top decile, but there is a very marked correlation. If you compare that to the US, for instance, in the US, in every income decile, you have a very large presence of businesses with 10 or more employees. There's a little bit more presence of smaller businesses towards the left, but the correlation is much less marked than in Latin America. Let me now talk a little bit about the shades. The shaded areas correspond to informal workers. So there's also a very close connection between the size of the business, employing your workers informally, and having, or not necessarily employing your workers informally, but being an informal worker, either employed by someone else or self-employed. That is to say, you're not covered by Social Security, and the size of the business. So those three phenomena, business size, income, and informality, are very closely correlated. Also, the correlation is not perfect. Even in the 10th decile, you have people who are informal. Even in the 10th decile, you have people who are self-employed. Those would be your lawyers and your architects and your physicians who have a private practice. But it is the case that in general, the people who live in poverty are very concentrated in micro businesses, in self-employment, and work informal. Those three characteristics are very concentrated. Okay, and then lastly, let me also mention that very related to what I was saying, there is a high wage or income earnings premium of working at a larger business. So what you have here is the average income of a person, depending on whether he or she is self-employed, works at a micro business, works or owns a micro business, or works or owns a larger business. And what you can see is that the average income grows with the size of the business that the person works at in Latin America, with very important premium So the average earnings of a person who works at a business with 50 or more employees more than doubles the average income of a person who works self-employed. Of course, part of this has to do with personal characteristics. So, for instance, more educated people are more likely to conduct skilled occupations. People who are in skilled occupations or skilled occupations may concentrate in larger businesses. So that's part of the story. But even if you control for those characteristics, and that's what we subsequently do in these other groups of bars, um, you still see a very marked gap. What does it mean to control, quote unquote, for these characteristics? Basically, if you look at the very last set of bars in this figure, in this graph, and you compare the bar of self-employment with the bar of people who are at a business with more than 50 employees. I'm comparing two people who are as similar as I can choose. So two people with the same level of education, two people who are either both of them are males, who are both of them are married, et cetera, and within the same sector. So again, very close connection between the type of business you work at, and in particular, the size of the business and whether you're self-employed or not, and the level of income. So that's paper number one. What I hope I've shown you with this paper number one is that the business landscape in Latin America is peculiar, different from those in more developed economies. And it's peculiar in the what I call the skewness of the business size distribution, that is to say, the huge prevalence of tiny businesses. And I hope I've also convinced you that disproportionate presence of this type of business has the feature of being very closely connected to the fact that a lot of people in these regions are receiving very low earnings, very low income from work. And in that sense, you cannot think of poverty and fighting poverty in Latin America uh, through tools that ignore the type of businesses that these firms are working at. And a solution to the problem of high prevalence of poverty, and in that sense, the contribution of poverty to inequality, has to go through understanding why Latin America has the type of business landscape that it has, and how to make sure that Latin America is able to transit to a world in which we have more small and medium enterprises rather than as many micro and self-employment businesses as we have today. That may mean that micro businesses, self-employed workers transit into becoming larger, or it may mean that we are able as a region to boost the entry of new businesses that already enter a little larger than what we are seeing today in the region, and that some of the people who today work at micro businesses or are self-employed abandon self-employment to become employed, abandon being employed at micro businesses to move to larger businesses, or see those businesses where they are currently working at grow at a much faster pace. The second paper that we wrote for this project now looks at the upper part of the business size distribution. So what I showed you before is more worried about the people who are receiving very low incomes and what types of businesses they are at. But of course, there is also, and you saw, prevalence of of tiny businesses in upper parts of the income distribution. And there's also the concern that perhaps even people who are employed in formal businesses may be receiving less income than they could. Given what I showed you before here, again, it's very difficult to think about fighting poverty without making a transition in terms of the types of businesses that we have. But still, people in the fourth decile and the fifth decile have relatively low income levels for in comparison to other regions in the world. And it is also the case that Latin America also exhibits inequality characterized by some owners of large businesses here in the upper part of the income distribution receiving incomes that are much, much larger than those of their workers. And so that's the type of question that we ask in the second paper. We're basically worried about the types of questions with which I introduced the session today, explaining that those questions are more the concern of developed economies, but in this second paper, we place attention to whether those patterns of high concentration of income in the owners by contrast to the workers of some businesses are or not a reason for concern in Latin America. And so in particular, what we do is we try to replicate what people have done for other parts of the world, now including Latin America and including a more comprehensive look at Latin America's businesses, trying to understand the, the, the potential for a term that has been used for this is exploitation, the possibility that firms, and in particular, more importantly, larger firms, exploit their workers in the specific sense of paying their wages that are below what or below the productivity that those workers are contributing to the firm with. And so, in particular, what we do here is we again, let me repeat. If I touch upon stuff that that's completely foreign to you, let me know because this paper has more technical aspects in a sense that you probably have not covered in this course before. So let me try to explain, but again to interrupt. So what we do in this paper is follow this literature to characterize what's called markups and labor markdowns. Markups are the gaps between the prices and the marginal costs that firms charge. And they allow the firm to make profits that are relatively high, to not simply reward the capital, but reward that capital over its sort of normal return. The existence of markups may simply reflect the fact that the firm, for instance, provides a product that's very highly appreciated by consumers, and that's very distinct from what other firms produce. And so in that sense, there will be exercise of product market power, the fact that the firm will be charging markups, but not necessarily a welfare loss, because the consumer may be paying a gap to receive something that he or she values. But it may also be that the firm is charging a higher markup simply because there are barriers to the entrance of competitors that are not necessarily driven by innovation. So in that sense, what I'm trying to say is markups of course have the negative consequence that people are paying a relatively high price, but it may be that high price is or is not justified on something that also increases the welfare of the consumer. From the point of view of understanding the income distribution, the question is, whether the firm charges a markup or simply makes standard profits, whether are those profits, again, excessive or not, are they shared with the workers or not? And so that's the question of the markdown. The markdown is going to be the gap that the firm, the gap that there is between the wage that the firm pays its workers and the productivity that the firm derives from the workers. And so the firm could, in principle, pay the workers up to the marginal productivity that it receives from those workers. And whether there is a gap between what the firm could pay and what it actually pays is the question of the mark. That's the calculation of the mark. So that's what we do. In this paper, we calculate markups and markdowns in Latin America. The calculation follows a literature that has become standard. Much attention has been drawn to the calculation of markups, and in fact, the comparison across countries in the world, and this is done by the Locker, Eckhout, and Company paper. But there's two problems to that paper. One, it does include Latin America, but again, same thing that I already mentioned. They are using a type of data that excludes many businesses in the region. And second, they are not calculating also markdowns, which is what a more recent literature has done. For instance, this 2022 paper in the AR. But that literature with markdowns is much less general, still covers only very particular cases. So what we try to do here is calculate markups and markdowns for a wide sample of countries, including Latin America, but being able to compare Latin America to others. And we do that resorting to a database that has information on firms, but that is much more comprehensive of smaller businesses than the types of data that the Looper et al. Used before. And so once we do that, we characterize the relationship with inequality, and in particular with what I called before functional inequality. That is how income is divided between the owners of the firms and their workers. Now, for the second paper, we do have to resort to databases on firms. And so that means necessarily that I'm missing all of the left tail of the business distribution that I showed you before. Again, that's a very important fraction in Latin America. If you think of, say, self-employment, that self-employment implies that the person is the owner and the employee of the firm. And so in that sense, it's not clear that we should worry about how income is shared between the owner and the employee of the firm for that fraction. So the question itself that we're addressing in this paper is sort of more focused on firms per se. And we try to cover it with a database that is as comprehensive as possible, but still will likely miss a lot of the micro enterprises that we know are prevalent in Latin America. So with that caveat in mind, however, let's proceed. Again, this is a facts paper. All we want to do is set stylized facts, understand whether or not firms in Latin America charge large markups, large markdowns, and whether that impacts functional inequality. And what we try to do is, in the end, understand to what extent, beyond the features that I already mentioned in the first paper, we also need to worry about the excessive exercise of power by firms, and in particular by large firms, impacting the incomes of workers and perhaps generating further inequality. The paper that I'm going to present, the paper that we wrote for last year, focuses on Latin America versus peers. There's a companion paper or a more academic paper that we're also writing, where we do this not only for Latin America versus peers, but we focus on the question of development, less versus more developed economies. And I'll refer to those findings while I present the findings for the last year paper here. The way in which we address the methodological challenges that I mentioned um, is to use data from the World Bank Enterprise Survey. Uh, this is a data set that includes the type of information that we need. And I'll briefly touch upon the technical aspects, but basically we need information on what fraction of a firm's revenues goes to buying materials versus paying employees. Um, and we need that for a wide variety of countries, and hoping that the data set is really representative of at least the formal business sector in each of the economies. So we use the World Bank Enterprise Survey, despite the fact that it only has relatively small samples in different countries. But the reason is this is a survey specifically thought for understanding enterprises in developing economies as compared to developed economies. So relative to the data sets that people in this literature use, which are, in case you're familiar with those, Compustat, Orbis, those are databases that have um, sort of balance sheet information for businesses. Relative to those sources, the World Bank Enterprise Survey has smaller samples, less detailed information, but it has a much better design in terms of covering smaller businesses, which are more prevalent in developing economies, as I already showed you before. So we have data from the World Bank Enterprise Survey for 16 Latin American countries and over 30 peers, that is to say, countries that have similar GDP per capita. The reason this is interesting for the inequality question is that those peers have similar GDP per capita, but less inequality than Latin America. So when looking at the comparisons that I'll be showing you, the kinds of questions that we are asking is, can we explain that Latin America has larger income inequality than those peers via something related to the types of markups and markdowns, levels of markups and markdowns that Latin American firms charge compared to firms in those countries? That's the type of question that we're asking. The sampling in the survey has firms over 5 employees. And so that's the reason we're missing the lower tail that I mentioned to you. We follow for measurement, and this is the technical part, what's called the production function approach. All I'm going to say about this is that it renders expressions such that without having specific data on the price and the marginal cost, each wage and each marginal productivity, which is some of these are abstract objects. Without that, we can measure markups and markdowns from the type of data that we do see. So let me just have the expressions in front of you, and so you know what I'm doing. But the technical details I'll skip because they're not they don't make that much sense for this course to go into. So basically, what this literature uses is the insight that when a firm is making optimal decisions, one could measure the markup of that firm by understanding how much the fraction of the revenues that the firm pays for acquiring materials, that's the M here. And this thing here is the fraction of the revenue that goes to pay materials. How much that differs from the elasticity of production of the firm compared to relative to materials. And the markdown is going to be a similar object for labor rather than materials, for employment rather than materials, adjusted by the markup. That's all I'm going to say. I'll be happy to discuss the technical details at the end, but all you need to know to understand my measurement is that I can measure these fractions in the data. Therefore, I can calculate the markup mu, and then I can measure these fractions in the data, and having the markup mu for each firm in the data, I can measure the markdown nu for each firm in the data. So this measurement is going to be conducted for each firm in the database, each firm in each country in the database. And then what I'm going to be showing to you is statistics that are calculated per country using the different markups and markdowns that I calculate for the firms. So hopefully that's more or less understandable. If there are no questions, I'll continue. But again, do feel free to stop me when you see the numbers if you want me to go back and relate to what I'm showing to you. Let me also mention that if you take this expression here and manipulate it and aggregate it over the different firms, notice that what you have in the denominator here is total payments to workers relative to total revenue by the firm. So if you aggregate this, you will have the measure of functional inequality for the economy. That is the labor share in revenue for these set of firms in the economy. How much of the revenue that firms are making is going to the workers as opposed to going to the owners of the firm, right? And so because of that, using this last expression, it turns out that you can relate that aggregate fraction of payments to workers to the markups and markdowns charged by firms. And it turns out, and this is sort of the key insight or a key insight in this literature, that the functional inequality, the functional income inequality depends on how large are markups and how large are markdowns in the economy. Basically, if firms are charging very large markups and the owners of the firms rather than the workers are keeping those profits to themselves rather than sharing them with the workers, then the functional inequality is going to be larger because the owners of the firms are making large profits and not sharing them with their workers. And that's the basic insight of this expression here, and that's something that we're going to be using. So again, we'll measure markups and markdowns for each firm, and then we will relate those markups and markdowns to the share of the revenue of the firm that goes to the employees, to the workers, and then subsequently to the economy overall. What's the share of income that's going to the workers rather than the owners of firms? Are there questions on sort of the basic reason that this is important? That this is important to understand inequality? Okay. So here are the results. You should read these numbers as follows. A number of 1, a markup of 1, is there's no markup. It's the ratio between prices and marginal costs is 1. They're the same. A markdown of 1 means there is no exploitation. The worker receives exactly the marginal, receives as wage exactly the same marginal productivity that it contributes, that he or she contributes to the firm. When the number is above 1, then there is exercise of market power. So what you see in this table is that Latin America indeed has large and important markups and markdowns. On average, a firm in Latin America charges a 24% price, a price that is 24% above the marginal cost. And on average, there are important markdowns. On average, a worker receives a wage that is 45% below the marginal productivity of the firm. The numbers that I just read are for the manufacturing sector, which is the sector that's best measured in this World Bank Enterprise Survey. So first, punchline, there are indeed important markups and markdowns in Latin America, and that implies that there may be or there is a part of inequality that is explained by the fact that the owners, and in particular the owners of firms that make markups and markdowns, are keeping to themselves. However, if you now look at the lower, at the bottom line in this table, then it turns out that this is not much worse, not worse at all than in peers. And in fact, Latin America has lower markups and markdowns than peer economies. So that is to say, to the extent that Latin America is more unequal than these peer economies, this is not explained by larger markups and markdowns, and should be explained by something that's elsewhere. For instance, what I already showed you, that Latin America has disproportionate self-employment and low income in self-employment. Let me now bring the results from the other paper, the companion paper that we're doing. What we do know as well is that in general, less developed economies, Latin America included, charge higher markups and markdowns. So even though we cannot explain higher inequality than in peers with markups and markdowns, we can explain at least a part of higher inequality with respect to developed economies with higher markups and markdowns. The other thing that's interesting, remember that what I'm showing here is just average numbers. So for each economy, we calculate the average over the different firms, and we have calculated markups and markdowns for each firm. Let me now show you how these things are dispersed across firms within the region. So the heterogeneity of markups and markdowns. This is what you see in these pictures here. The x-axis is the markup or the markdown. And what you see is the distribution of markups and markdowns. So what you see in the left, in the vertical axis, is a measure of the fraction of firms in each level of markups and markdowns. And what you see is that there's quite a bit of dispersion. These numbers here are in logs and centered around the mean. So a 0 would be the average markup and the average markdown. And you see that there is indeed quite a lot of dispersion. Interestingly enough, not more dispersion than in peers, if anything, less dispersion than in peers. So to the extent that dispersion is also inequality, again, this type of inequality cannot be explained by difference with peers. That is to say, Latin America has less dispersion in markups and markdowns than peers. Why would the dispersion of markups and markdowns matter? The dispersion of markdowns certainly matters because it means that different firms are paying different wages for a given level of their marginal productivity. Are paying different wages, not explained by those firms being different in terms of the productivity that they obtain for their workers. So that implies a given level of inequality, even for people who are similar in the particular sense of delivering similar productivity to the economy via the firms they work at. So this is important in itself. And so again, first, there is dispersion. Dispersion means inequality, at least in markdowns, and so that's worrisome. Not more dispersion than in peers, but yes, more dispersion than in less developed, than in more developed economies. Sorry. And then finally, going now to the question of the labor share again, what share of revenue goes to workers rather than going to the employers or the owners. What we depict here is the relationship between that labor share and markups and markdowns, which you saw in the expression that I showed you. The labor share decreases in markups and markdowns. And what you see in these pictures is that in Latin America, it's not the markup dispersion that explains dispersion in revenue shares. So you see that the markups do vary, but they do not explain why the revenue share varies across firms. However, there's a lot of correlation between the dispersion in markdowns and the dispersion in revenue shares. That is to say, the firms that pay less to their workers as a fraction of their revenue are also the firms that have a higher markdown, that are paying wages below their marginal productivity of labor. And then finally, it turns out that those firms that are charging the higher markdowns are also the larger firms. So the overall picture is within the formal sector, you have large firms that charge large markdowns. That is to say, they pay their workers much less than they could via margin revenue productivity. And because they are paying their workers less than they could, then they share their overall revenue much less with their workers than firms that are smaller and have lower markdowns. So the key takeaways from the second paper is that in Latin America, there are high markups and markdowns, and this contributes to inequality, especially large firms charge large markdowns, and this decreases the share of revenue that goes to workers. Having said that, and this is the last bullet point in this slide, this is not, or these are not the set of features that distinguish Latin America more in comparison to other countries, and in particular to other countries with similar GDP per capita but lower inequality. So if we are to explain that excess inequality in Latin America, I would refer you to the first paper that we saw today in the presentation, and say that the feature we should worry the most in terms of the type of environment, of business environment in the region, and how it contributes to inequality is the inability that the region has exhibited to develop a more robust section of small and medium enterprises and even larger corporations, and the consequent predominance of very low organizational capabilities forms of production, which are the ones that you see in self-employment and micro enterprises.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, Marcela. We have a question already in the Q&A, and I'll read it for you. It says, your findings suggest that while market power exacerbates inequality in Latin America and the Caribbean, it may not be the primary factor of the region's inequality levels. The point you were just addressing in your conclusions. What other structural factors do you think contribute most to this inequality?
So again, I would refer you to paper one. So let me emphasize that I'm here speaking from the point of view of the characteristics of the business sector. Mm-hmm. So if you take together the two sets of papers that I mentioned, I would point at the region's inability to foster a more robust layer of small and medium enterprises by contrast to tiny businesses as the main structural factor behind the high prevalence of low levels of income. If you have a large fraction of your working population, let me say, quote unquote, trapped at types of businesses that are inherently low productivity, cannot grow, and also bring features such as informal employment because they are basically so low productivity that they do not generate enough revenue to pay for what would be needed to become formal and formalized workers, then those very large, that very large fraction of workers working in their poor conditions are going to, in terms of the inequality statistics, show up as people living in poverty. You have seen in these sessions, surely, the distribution of income in Latin America depicted and compared to other regions. And you know that it is characterized by a very thick and profound lower tail, bottom tail of the income distribution. And what I showed you today implies that that thick bottom tail is working in general, own account, or in micro businesses. And the fact that those two facts coincide imply that in terms of policy prescriptions, addressing poverty, addressing that part, that very important part of inequality, requires developing a more robust business sector that is able to bring in more people and pay higher income.
And what types of policy interventions would be likely to accomplish that? And you know, one thing that comes to mind is the very popular idea that channeling microloans, for example, is a good development strategy. This would probably speak against that type of policy intervention, right?
Yeah, that's my reading. I think what we see in the data suggests that in Latin America we have too much entrepreneurship, if that's possible. Too much entrepreneurship of not the most powerful kind. So we have every own account worker is an entrepreneur. But what we saw today suggests that a very large fraction of those entrepreneurs are what we call survival entrepreneurs rather than transformation entrepreneurs, are not the type of entrepreneurs that can create a business, make it grow, hire lots of people, but rather have businesses from which they source some income, and that's the alternative way of life that they found. But those businesses have no power to grow. And so indeed, the popular recipes of fostering micro entrepreneurship, I believe in Latin America, maybe a useful social policy tool in the sense that to the extent that there are no good employment opportunities, they endow people with some ability to create some income, but they are not a good developing strategy, and they are less powerful to combat inequality than a more structural solution in developing those abilities to generate better businesses would be. What are the strategies that would work? That's the 100 million question. There's lots of people working on that. The research that I've been conducting tries to answer precisely that question. And what I would tell you is, of course, there is a wide range of policies that can be implemented and interventions. In my list, in terms of priorities, I would say the first thing, even before interventions that, for instance, subsidize particular types of businesses, etc., the first thing is to ask, why is it that these micro enterprises do not grow more? Why is it that people work self-employed rather than organizing in a different type of organization or becoming hired? And what I see in the data and what my analysis pointed at is that a very important barrier is a lack of is a labor regulation that is unrealistic for the type of human capital and the type of business environment that we already have. Think about it this way: you have someone. The average, the median employee in Colombia, the 50th percentile employee, earns the minimum wage. That means that half of the workers in Colombia are making less than the minimum wage. And I showed you a picture where lots and lots of people below the minimum wage, the people who are in the first 5 bars of my deciles, lots of them work self-employed. So that means that working on their own account, meaning they're not exploited, the level of income that they are able to make, which reflects their productivity, is much less than the minimum wage. If to become an employed salaried worker at a formal firm and earn the minimum wage, they would have to be paid the minimum wage. And on top of that, the firm has to pay social security contributions that in many of these countries are for 50% or more than wage. then that means that there is a large gap between the productivity that this person can bring to a firm and what the firm would have to pay him or her. And so to me, that's, or this is not an interpretation, is the result of the analysis that me and other people have carried, points at this gap between the reality and the regulation as an important contributing factor. What to do about it? Should we just erase the minimum wage? Of course not. That's politically not feasible to start with, but also not necessarily convenient because minimum wages are there for a reason. But the fact is, with the high informality and with these many people earning less than the minimum wage, um, that reason is not being accomplished, or that objective is not being accomplished. And so the kinds of things that you could do is, for instance, think of subsidies to firms, but specifically tied to the employment of low ability people. So how about, rather than just subsidizing firms, as many governments do, what they subsidize is as part of the minimum wage that a new employee who was previously informal, for instance, previously self-employed, part of that wage is subsidized by the government. Um, in a way, it's like, rather than subsidizing people who earn low income to make up for the low income that they make, let's try to subsidize the transition of those people to better jobs. So that's one example of the kinds of things that could be done. This requires, of course, reform that better things labor regulations, but even interventions aimed at easing the consequences of these harmful regulations, targeted to specific groups of people, those who are more vulnerable, into specific, for instance, regions. There are regions where the productivity is lower, and firms and the missing middle of small and medium enterprises is more stark than, say, in the capital cities.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time and a bit over, so we're going to have to leave it there. And let me reiterate our thanks both on my behalf and on behalf of Nora Lustig for your time and your lucid explanations today, Marcela. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, and hope to have been clear, and thanks for all the questions. Very interesting.
Thank you.